So, ladies and gentlemen, data give us an important micro picture, but numbers never alone never tell us the full story. Behind the figures are political choices, strategic shifts, and changing global realities. And that's why we're moving to our second panel discussion titled Interpreting the Data, How Do Numbers Really Tell Us? And we have, we're delighted to host Mrs. Elena Lazarou from ELIAMEP. She's a Director General of ELIAMEP. She has an extensive expertise in European governance and strategic affairs. And also with us is Ms. Ivana Zuzul, Vice President for Europe at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And she works at the forefront of the transatlantic business and policy engagement. Ladies, welcome to our event here. Do we have you online here? Oh, yes.
Thank
Thank
you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us. So let's have some interesting conversation here. I will start with Elena. Can I speak in with the small names, or I guess
absolutely,
we can.
Absolutely. I should just warn you, I have a very bad connection because I'm in a hotel in Berlin. So if anything happens, it's not because you used my name, my first name. It's because the connection is bad.
It's all right. It's all right, Elena. Thank you, and lovely city, by the way, Berlin. So, first question to you is: how much has geopolitics changed the way economic policy is now designed?
So I think I want to answer that as, first of all, by saying I'm not an economist, but as I've been looking at EU policies for a very long time, what I want to focus on, and, following up on the previous speaker who I listened to with a lot of interest, is the geoeconomic turn and the geopolitical turn in EU trade policy. Because now we're talking about EU-US relations and Greece-US relations. And of course, what we're talking about is economic figures and inflation. But at the end of the day, what we want to understand is how geopolitics and geoeconomics have affected the trade and investment relationship between the two. Not forgetting how that, in 2025, the trade in services and the trade in goods between the EU and the US is the closest and the biggest relationship in the world in trade terms. But we've seen indeed that for the European Union, and of course that means Greece as well, as trade is an EU competence, geoeconomics have really altered the nature of how trade is seen. And I say this because, it's been a number of years now under the two von der Leyen commissions, and I would say it even started with the Juncker Commission, that there's been a shift in trade policy trying to reconcile the openness that the EU abides by and, multilateralism with a certain degree of resilience and autonomy in trade. And that means that both in terms of who the EU trades with and what kind of trade deals it makes, it is diversifying its portfolio to ensure that supply chain resilience is achieved. And secondly, when it comes to the kind of regulations, the kind of laws that affect the way that trade is carried out, we've seen an increase in the amount of and the type of regulations that attempt to limit coercive trade and so coercive action towards the EU's economy. So in that sense, we've seen instruments that address coercive action in trade. We've seen instruments that address the types of investments that weaponize critical infrastructure. We've seen attempts to have established in regulatory action a level playing field in international procurement and international investment. And all of this is really about geoeconomics and geopolitics. It's about China. It's about the way that certain goods are really, controlled by certain countries. And the classic thing we mentioned here is, critical raw minerals and the amount of exports of those that China processes, refines, and exports, and chips. So all of these, I don't want to talk more because I know this is a quick conversation, but this is the kind of ways in which I think trade has been affected, and by proxy the economy as well, because that means that you also need an economy which to a degree reshores but also diversifies sources of production.
Thank you, Lena. Ivana, when you look at the current economic indicators, are you fundamentally optimistic or cautious about the future of transatlantic relations? You are the forefront, actually, of the transatlantic. I think this question is perfect for you.
Yeah, both professionally and personally, because I was born and raised in Croatia, and I've now been in the United States for a long time. So the transatlantic relationship is important to me, not just from where I sit at the U.S. Chamber, but on a deeply personal and family level. Look, I'll speak to the transatlantic commercial relationship, which is complex enough without expanding the conversation into the security or political dimension. Although increasingly, we're seeing that all three of those are interlinked, and a lot of the concerns and I would say conflict that we are seeing in the political sphere is unfortunately beginning to bleed over into the commercial sphere as well, which I think thus far has been relatively insulated from, again, some of those political dynamics. I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. This is the world's largest and most important trading relationship. It is a trading relationship that has time and again demonstrated remarkable resilience, including over this last period of really global, economic, political, strategic upheavals. I'm optimistic because I think the numbers, and I know Thibaut went into some of this, sort of the top line numbers do not actually paint an accurate picture of just how deeply integrated our commercial ties are. It's not just about trade in goods and services. It's about investment in each other's markets and the types of investments we make in each other's markets. Those types of investments tend to be built on shared research and development, investment in innovation, growth of jobs. I think we've really become embedded in each other's, host economies in a way that we don't see happening with other trading partners. But there is a growing divergence in areas beyond trade that make, I think, the political foundation of the relationship much less stable. And as I said, there are headwinds, I think, that are spilling over from that political sphere into the economic sphere. So we're seeing, the rise of protectionism, and I know we'll sort of get into this more a little bit later. We are, seeing potentially restricting market access to trading partners, including between the US and the EU. And I think for the EU, one notable economic indicator is the reduction in US FDI in the EU in this past year. I think that is happening both because of developments here in the United States, but also because of developments in the EU. Frankly, for US capital as well, the US is becoming a more attractive place to invest rather than the EU. I think the EU is facing some structural challenges, such as market fragmentation. I think it is facing some difficult global challenges, including really high energy prices and a high cost of production. But it is also facing a lot of regulatory challenges that, again, are making particularly new investments, which is where we are seeing the biggest drop in FDI, posing some genuine questions about the long-term attractiveness of the EU as an investment destination. So I think we have to be cognizant of that trend and try to get ahead of that trend.
Actually, you mentioned this before. It was my next question to you and also to Elena as well. How serious? I mean, we all seen, have seen, how the tariffs situation has gone. Actually, right now we have the overturn, from the Supreme Court of the tariffs, and we don't know exactly where this will end up. But anyway, how serious is the risk of increasing protectionism here? Ivana and then Elena, please.
Sure. I would say the risk is very serious. This is a top concern of the Chambers Europe team for this year when we look at the US-EU relationship. Look, I think we are sort of in a new strategic era of trade policy, right? Where we're using tariffs, subsidies, industrial policy, not just for protection, but sort of as instruments of geopolitical competition. I think a lot of this is happening or began to happen in response to pressures both of our markets are seeing from China, including from industrial overcapacity, threat of theft of intellectual property. But it is now becoming increasingly a marker in the US-EU relationship as well. I will just say from the onset, the Chamber has never been a huge supporter of Buy America or Buy American provisions unless they are very narrowly targeted at answering very specific national security or national economic interests. Having said that, I do think that there is a misunderstanding of just how those are structured in practice and how EU firms are accessing public procurement in the United States. We are seeing really worrying proposals coming out of the EU, including under the Industrial Accelerator Act. We're watching very closely what will happen in July when the Commission proposes changes to the overall public procurement directive. We've seen, again, some worrying trends on the Defense Procurement Directive. We're seeing concerning trends on tech sovereignty, cloud infrastructure, and again, the ability of our companies to participate fairly in the European market. And I think the threat of escalation is also very real. I believe if we sort of move in this direction on the EU side, we will move in this direction on the US side, and it won't be proportional to the perceived level of threat or economic risk. So where does that kind of leave us? I mean, I think resilience, we are in a moment where resilience is a serious question. And I think both the US and the EU do have to think very strategically around how to build resilience in their markets, in their economies, and in their supply chains. We would caution that resilience should not be equalized to localization requirements, which I think is what we sometimes see reflected in policy. And I think that there's not just room, but really an imperative for the EU and the US to think through how do we structure joint resilience? Because frankly, the types of competitive markets that allow US companies to compete effectively are also the types of competitive markets that allow EU companies to compete effectively, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the United States. And so we need to think jointly about how do we protect those competitive markets from being able to function appropriately without undue stress on the transatlantic relationship. But it's the political dynamics, I think, are taking over. And I'm worried they're going to create a commercial reality that will be negative for years, well after those political dynamics shift in either direction.
Well, that drives me to the question about, the policymakers. Actually, I think, Elena, you can answer this one. And of course, anyone can step in, the conversation and comment on each other's, answer. Do you think, not do you think, actually, we are observing this, a growing mistrust between policymakers in US and EU? And, okay, how this can be fixed? And what is the role of business sectors in this, in fixing this? Because business sector, at the end, they have a saying here. So what do you think, Elena?
Thank you. And I'll comment on that. And I'll also sort of piggyback on some things that Ivana said, because I completely agree with her. And so before I go to your question, there's a couple of things just to reinforce what she said. The trend that we call protectionism and goes under many names. It goes under the name Made in XYZ, and we're seeing an increasing, Ivana speaking from the US, and we've been talking in Europe a lot about, this Made in America brand that has been synonymous for Europe with the threat of, some degree of protectionism. But increasingly in Europe, you also hear the Made in Europe very, very much. And I think the various legislative components that Ivana mentioned allude or very explicitly refer to that. Defense is a sector that Ivana mentioned, and we're seeing that very much there, but it goes to other areas again. And I actually, it's a phenomenon we're seeing elsewhere. If you go to India, you go to, a degree of autonomy and, sort of reshoring and also sort of homegrown production. And I mean, I won't even mention China, but that is happening globally. And it's been happening for a while. I just think we've had at least 3 geopolitical phenomena that have accelerated that. One has definitely been COVID, because the realization of dependencies that came through that. The second is the proliferation of conflicts with parties that were not aligned with the US or the US, and that weaponized those kinds of export controls to actually create these kinds of dependencies and really create economic and political instability through weaponizing them. And the third, and we're seeing that very clearly now with the Straits of Hormuz, is actually the geographical component of weaponization of trade, and how that also creates a sense of a need for not only resilience, but also a degree of autarky, if you want, to have enough and to create enough and to have an industry that is enough to serve the market. So all of this is leading to these made in XYZ phenomenon being embedded in legislation and being supported. It's actually a move that 10 years ago, we were talking about deglobalization. And I think in many ways it speaks to that as well, because the more we see that multilateral organizations like the WTO and others become increasingly less abided by, we're also seeing at the same time these kind of phenomena. And so, we're seeing this across the board, and to a degree, and here I speak because I'm a security and defense person, to a degree, invoking national emergencies and defense and security priorities, there does make sense. So I think there is a degree to which each entity is increasingly as well in an environment where we don't really see the kind of alliances that we used to see, where states agree on across the board the issues. It's more like we have now little coalitions on different fronts of different things. So on energy, you may agree with one party, but then on another area, you agree. I think it makes sense to have a degree of, it also makes economies competitive, of productivity at home. It creates job markets. These are things that everyone is thinking about. But on the other hand, we have to think about, in a time of increasing need for resilience and incorporation of resilience in legislation, how do we also do this together thing that Ivana mentioned? And I think building resilience together, and for the US and EU and for allies in general, is really the bet here. And the solution, I think, is in a form of, and I'm not advocating for one or the other name for it, the Trade and Technology Council that existed a few years ago between the EU and the US. It's just a mechanism, but it is a mechanism really to think about those key issues that define this protectionism that you mentioned, export controls, technology transfer, sanctions, regulatory instruments, at least to have a forum of kind of understanding how one affects the other, and to sort of think of some degree of alignment. If that were possible, I think this would definitely be a way to move on some of these fronts, and also to address obstacles, because as Ivana has mentioned, on both sides, I think legislation creates challenges for the other side, right? And this is not about who is in government at the, we've seen this also before. We saw that with the CHIPS Act, we saw it with the Inflation Reduction Act, the way what it meant for Europe, and of course on the other side of the Atlantic, Ivana has mentioned a number of items, regulatory items, that have created this. There needs to be a forum of frank discussion, but not only discussion, but sort of addressing these grievances, because the truth of the matter is we are living in a world where scale and size matters. And yes, we may have the biggest trading relationship in the world right now, but that is not a constant, and we see demographically, if only, but also in terms of GDP, the growth of other actors in the world. And the way that, the reorganization of the energy security environment as well is affecting productivity and markets. This might end up creating a very new constellation of powers, and we need to be ready to address it. A final point, because Ivana mentioned the structural challenges that Europe faces and how that is at times deterring investment. And this is something I think that really needs to be addressed on the European side, and we do see the relevant policy being produced. A couple of other things that need to be addressed is the energy cost of production in the EU. It remains much higher than in the US at the moment, and there are efforts to address this. Innovation scaling, which I think you alluded to, is not only as competitive as the US innovation scaling, but also fragmented. And of course, the biggest thing right now that we're talking about on the EU side is the integration of capital markets. And I think this, the completion of the single market, the Letta report, the Draghi report, these are things that inevitably are necessary to create this kind of investment and innovation environment that we need.
That's correct. By the way, speaking about other powers surfacing, of course, we're talking about China right now. First of all, I will ask Ivana how the U.S. Chamber viewed the recent travel to President Trump's and the economic outcome of this, let's say, negotiation with China. And on the other hand, also, I want to ask you. To conclude. And on the other hand, I want to ask whether China might be, let's say, the how to say that, the opportunity for the two continents to get together and start aligning in many other things. For example, Thibault mentioned that a week ago was a signing of this critical minerals agreement between EU and the US, and I think probably that was signed because of some geopolitical also concerns. So, can you elaborate on this one?
Look, I would not sort of comment on any of the political
economic
of the president's visit. I mean, look, I think what we sort of saw coming from the visit is kind of a continued détente of where the relationship stands now. By the fall, we will be looking at the expiration of the temporary Chinese ban on exports of sensitive materials. I do expect to see that we will see that extended as we get near into the fall. And I think that's why we're seeing some indications around a potential second meeting of the US and China with that aim. But none of sort of the inherent challenges of the relationship have been addressed. And they're going to be really, really difficult to address. When it comes to the US and the EU, I think the critical minerals MOU and then action plan is a really positive first step, both in the opportunities that it creates, but also in the type of trajectory that it can create. We know that critical raw materials, access to energy, access to high technology, access to critical infrastructure, whether it's maritime or it's road or rail. These are places where, frankly, the US government, I would say, over the last decade and a half, has not placed a lot of thought in terms of what is happening in the rest of the world and what is that creating in terms of a strategic security, but also economic problem for the United States. And I think Europe is facing the same challenges. Both sides were really enthusiastic about the deal. I actually was kind of surprised at the relatively muted public rollout, because I think privately we heard both from the EU Commission, but also from the US government, that the negotiations had gone really well. Even in this very challenging moment where negotiations on everything else, including hopefully we're in a better place at the end of today in terms of the tariff deal, are not going particularly smoothly. So I think that speaks to the strategic importance and the value that we still place on this relationship. Let's see how it goes. I think it's important to build sort of a small initial success case and then see if it can be extended and expanded into other critical areas. But again, I view it as really a recognition by the US government. There are places here that we cannot go at this alone. And it's really, really critical that we have those commercial alliances to create the backbone of a resilient supply chain.
Well, let's hope this is a prelude, for more to come, actually, agreements on other levels or issues. Speaking about, the perception of the policymakers, I guess, this has to do also with the composition of the political, let's say, environment in both actually continents. They're not, in US we did have in the past very two solid, let's say, parties, having some differences, but on the let's say on the foreign policy and everything, they were quite the same. In EU we have all kind of parties here, so I think this has to do, so I guess some of the things that we are not let's say listening and hearing are part of the rhetoric, because at the end we see agreements like the one that we just talked about, and maybe more to come actually, because at the end we see that there is only one way, how we can collaborate and work together, because this relation between Europe, and US, it's a long-standing relation, and it's beyond economics. It's based on values, on traditions, and many things. Okay, any comment on that?
I can comment. You're going into my political science field. No, I think you're absolutely right, and maybe I'll jump on what you said to take the opportunity to say that I think when it comes to politics, we have to try and not pay attention to the noise on many fronts. And, speaking of Europe, for example, we like to monitor very closely, citizens also, small fringe parties that may have, devastating rhetoric for global affairs and foreign policy. But in fact, what is worth monitoring is actually the consensus, as you said. And we've spoken about a number of trade-related instruments, for example, which have been passed as EU level law. And that means they've passed both through the Council, so through the governments of the member states, but also through the European Parliament, through a majority that is quite, majorities are quite robust in the European Parliament. So I think it's important to know and to notice that, if there is an instrument and, against coercion in trade, it's because there is a huge majority that has gone for it on both the national member state government level and on the European Parliament level, which represents, the political forces. And that goes for every instrument that has to do with, the energy policy, the trade policy, etc., industrial policy. So it's important to say that is a consensus-based, a majority, yes, but, it's a big qualified majority. And at the same time, I think it's also important to pay attention to those, we talk again, when we look at US politics, the tendency, you read the newspapers to see what are the great polarization issues, and there are, and I'm not undermining their importance, but it's also important to see where are the bipartisan in Congress agreements when it comes to trade, when it comes to China. I think these are the kind of things that, one always needs to pay attention to. Having said that, because you had asked me a question about businesses and I didn't really address it, and maybe now as we approach the end, it's the time to say, trade policy, but also foreign policy today, in a time of, as we have said, geoeconomics, is no longer only about policymakers. It is also about businesses. It is about other stakeholders as well. And we've seen the way in which those can step up and be part of bilateral and multilateral relationships. So what I want to say is also that you mentioned, what role do businesses play, and what role do, worker associations play, and what roles do universities play, because they also play a role in building the skills and contributing to the upskilling and the reskilling that makes economies competitive. All of this at a time where, as has been said, energy, transport, maritime security, shipbuilding, digital infrastructure building, the latest space-based technology, artificial intelligence, all these have become areas which are extremely important to determining geopolitical constellations of power, but none of those are achievable without the constant exchange of communication, of the bottlenecks, of the need for injection of capital from the business sector to the policymakers and vice versa. But also I want to stress the human capital side of this, the understanding that this also involves a very important investment in people, in skills, because that is also, to me, something that links both the needs of the policymakers and the businesses on both sides of the Atlantic. If that kind of competitiveness will be achieved, which in the end will give leverage both on the diplomatic or geopolitical side, but also on the geoeconomic and trade side, because let's not forget, in my lifetime, these are, interlinked more than ever.
Thank you, Elena. 1 minute, something, Ivana, maybe you want to add or comment or say something before we close this session?
No, only to thank you, Elias. It's always a pleasure to speak to you, whether virtually or in person. And we at the Chamber are really grateful to you and to your team and to AmChams that we have across Europe for really sort of pushing the message of the importance of this relationship at a company level, at a state economy level, but also at the global level. So thank you for everything that you're doing, and it's always a pleasure to partner with you.
And we thank the US Chamber also, because, we are very good, let's say we are aligned in many things, and definitely, we need each other, to connect, the two continents and advocate, for the common goals that we do have here. So ladies, thank you very much, for joining, this event here. And I hope you stay in line because we have right now the bilateral thing. Maybe you want to stay online here. So we're moving
May I
now.
add my thanks? I
Go ahead.
didn't get the chance to thank, but I also want to thank you. Sorry for intervening like this, but I also want to thank you for having had us, and Ivana
Thank
as
you,
well
Elena.
for listening to her. I hope I meet you in person as well one day. And I also want to thank the American-Hellenic Chamber of Commerce for including us think tankers in this meeting, because I think this is a multi-stakeholder issue. And thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Really, we appreciate your collaboration, your presence here, and we're looking forward, for, let's say, physical, panel next time. Okay, so
Thank you.